Hi, this is Lisa B. Marshall and Marc A. Wolfe from MarshallWolfe.com. And today we'll be talking about listening skills. So, Marc, have you ever been taught specifically how to listen?
No, growing up, we were listening because there was consequences if we didn't listen. So that was about it. But actually,
It was
go
a
ahead.
you will listen?
That was pretty much the way it was, and there was no real listening skills at work that were instructed either. But I decided that it was more important to make sure that I saw a big gap between what people do now and them not listening. That I decided to teach my children listening skills.
Really?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you want them to listen because if they don't, you're going to wind up having to do it anyhow. What they don't do. So
right, but specifically, what do you do to teach your kids how to listen better?
One of the things I do is when I explain a task or something that needs to get done, especially something I know they're not really wanting to do, I go and I give them the task, and then I ask them to repeat back to me exactly what that task was. And I make sure I tweak it to get exactly what I want them to do so they don't cut out the part that they don't like.
Does it work?
Yes, it usually does work because they decide that there's a consequence for not taking care of that task, and it actually is something that they wind up wanting to do. There's usually a reward system involved. Because it's funny, if you tell them you're going to have ice cream, that listening skill always seems to work. They always seem to remember that one. You could whisper it from across the room, and I think that's the same with adults. If you told somebody that there was some reward, it's funny how you could just make sure that in an offhanded comment you say it, and they always pick up on that. How's that work, Lisa?
It's so funny. Just yesterday, my kids speak Spanish and English, and we've been working on complete sentences, right? That's the thing that we've been trying to get them to have complete sentences in Spanish. And so yesterday, my daughters were asking about wanting to make a cake. And so they kept saying, Mommy, can we make a cake? Mommy, can we make a cake? Mommy, can we make a cake? So finally I agreed. I said, yes, you can make a cake. And so they ran up the stairs, and in a complete full Spanish sentence, they said, my mommy said that it's okay, we're going to make a cake. And that was a whole entire sentence in Spanish. And I was like, there we go. We just needed to have cake as the incentive.
But adults are no different. It's funny, if you're incentivized, you decide you're going to be focused and listening. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges nowadays is that there's so much input coming into our minds and everything's vying for our attention that it's very, very hard to focus on one thing. So what we do is we wind up just having mediocrity toward a lot of the things that we are told to do nowadays.
Now it's interesting that that's the way you're teaching your kids. My father had a different approach. My father decided that he was going to get us to have critical listening skills. And the way he approached this, I know I've mentioned to you before, I came from a family of five, so I'm the youngest of five. We used to sit down to dinner every night. Every night was a formal dinner, and my dad would tell us stories. And sometimes the stories were true, and many times the stories were mostly true, but he'd have an aspect that wasn't true. And his whole goal was for us to listen carefully enough to say, no, Daddy, that can't be right. No, that's not true. And then sometimes, of course, he would specifically try to find those really wild stories, that were true stories in the news. And he would tell us, and we'd be like, we don't believe you. And he'd actually have to get the newspaper, of course, the newspaper at the time, and show us that it really was a true story. We're like, show us, because we don't believe you. And, of course, later in my career, when I first started working, that ran into a little bit of trouble with that one. Because our favorite phrase would be, I find that hard to believe. And a boss...
You never said that to your boss, did you?
Of course I did. Many times. Until I learned that wasn't the right way.
So learning listening skills can work either way. So you have to know how to actually say the right thing at the right time sometimes and be too authentic.
Right. There's listening skills and there's speaking skills. Right. I knew how to listen carefully. It was the speaking part I was struggling with.
So what's some tips? You have some tips for how to do better listening skills and actively listen?
Yeah, I do. I think, though, some people say to me, I'm not a very good listener. I'm not a very good listener. And I think it's important to recognize that sometimes we're not good listeners because over time, as we get older and older and older, we're learning to tune stuff out. There's just so much stuff around us. we're in the classroom and there's 15 other kids around you and you're trying to do your work, so you tune them out. Or you're in a work environment, you're sitting in your cube and there's 20 other cubes around, there's phones ringing, people having conversations in the hallway next to you, and so you learn to tune all that stuff out around you, so when it comes time to actually listen, that's a harder skill.
Yes.
So
yes. In a world of multitasking, in a world where everybody thinks they can do it all at the same time, in a world where there's demands on your time significantly, trying to prioritize and trying to really focus is critically different.
Right. So I think that people have to recognize that A, it's a skill, B, you have to learn it, and C, that it's something that you're training yourself on a regular basis not to do. So you have to really put effort into listening. It's not just because we have two ears on the side of our head that we know how to listen. And I think that for some people, they think, well, of course I know how to listen. Why wouldn't I know how to listen? And I
Prove it.
Right. So here's the thing. So what are the steps, right? That's what you're asking. What are my tips? So what are the steps to listening? So the first thing, of course, is that you need to tune in. So part of tuning in means tuning out. Right. All the other stuff that's going on around you and only listening, tuning into the thing that you need to tune into. And that means, for me, actually physically turning my body, giving the eye contact, leaning in if I have to, but really showing that, or at least trying to show that I'm actually listening to the person. And that, in fact, would be sort of the second step, is showing to that person. So, maybe I'm doing this here. Show me that you're listening, Mark. Show me. Go ahead. Again, there's a bit of an exaggeration.
Engaged.
Right, but certainly.
Not being on my iPhone, would that be a good sign of listening?
Yeah,
you mean when somebody's actually having a conversation, you're not looking down at
you're not hearing this, right? You're not hearing the clicks and the ticks from the computer.
Right.
So you have to tune in, you have to show that you're listening, and then you need to start interpreting what the person is saying. And notice I'm not just translating what the person is saying. So you're listening to those words, and you're looking at their face, you're looking at their body, and you're thinking to yourself, what is the meaning of those words? So sometimes people need to remember that the meaning of the word might be different, right? You have a meaning for a word, and I have a meaning for a word, and I may say a word assuming that you're understanding the same meaning that I have for that word. Very simplistic. Let's say I say the word wheel, right? Okay. When I say wheel, right, imagine in your head. I'm going to imagine a wheel in my head. Are you ready? Okay. So what's the wheel that you have in your head? I'm
thinking about a steering wheel.
Okay. So for me, my wheel that I imagine when somebody says wheel, I generally envision this wheel it's actually a picture that I took from England of this big water wheel that turns and it's got the water spilling out of it. And in my mind, when I think of wheel, I generally think of that. And so if you're communicating to someone, you can't just assume that my wheel is your wheel.
Right. And that difference can be significant. So when you say something, that really interpretation can really be lost. So obviously that's step 3, which is going to be how we're going to go and make sure that what I'm hearing is actually the correct answer, which is repeating back or communicating that idea back to that person.
Well, yes, and while you're communicating it back, you may question them, actually. So you're going to be saying, well, when you said this, when you said wheel, did you mean this? When you said I needed to do this, did you mean specifically this, and this? So you're asking questions, even if you think you know, and I think a lot of people only ask questions when they don't know something. I think it's important to ask questions when you think you do know.
Well, people fear asking questions because they think it makes them look dumb. But the point is that if you don't ask questions and you do it wrong, you probably don't look much smarter.
Right. Or you make a mistake, which is worse. Right.
And that's where communication is really just not listening and active listening and all the buzzwords. It's actually by accomplishing whatever the task was that you were set out to do.
Right. Okay, so that last step, of course, is to confirm that your understanding is the same as what you were being asked to do.
Right.
Excuse me.
So with those 3 steps, is it just that easy, Lisa? Knowing those steps, can we just put that into practice now that we know that?
No.
It takes a lot of practice and a lot of work, and you actually have to be engaged in that process.
Not only that. I think you need to think about the steps when you're listening. I remember the very first time, this is ingrained in my mind. I remember the very first time that you or I were having a conversation about something, and I'd given you something to do, or I'd asked you to do something, and you said to me, "Now, let me just make sure I got that right. What I heard you say was, Lisa, that you asked me to do," and you repeated back, you paraphrased back to me whatever it was that I said, and I giggled. I was like, "Oh, you had listening skills training," because you don't hear people say that very often. Right? You don't hear people say, "So let me make sure I got that right." And it would cut out so much further conflict down the road if people just asked a few questions and confirmed their understanding with that person.
And I appreciate that remembering of that event, because what happened is that continues to help understand and help move things ahead. I was always taught, again, as a young adult in business, that it was about really making sure that the things got done that were supposed to get done. And there was no excuse that didn't get done. And I've tried to lead as a boss, even our intern, even other people that we work with. I look at it and say, ask me a question. And I'll go and prompt them to make sure and say, "Hey, how are you doing that task?" And they'll tell me back. Some people might say it's micromanaging. That's only if you're doing it constantly. You just want to make sure, and then you start to feel comfortable to say, "You know what, this person's getting it. They're starting to comprehend. They understand my language and how I'm interpreting things or how I'm presenting it, and they're not misinterpreting it." So you can start to see that someone starts to get the way you present yourself, and then they have a little bit more freedom. But in the beginning, wheel could be a lot of different things.
Right, but even so, I think, though, that's exactly where some people do go wrong. Like, for example, their boss. They've been working with the guy for a year. They think they understand. They think they don't need to take those extra steps to confirm the understanding. And when they don't take the steps to confirm, that's when the problem happens. So I personally think that if it's an important conversation, whether it's an important conversation with your boss or an important conversation with your significant other, you need to kind of go, click, this is important. I'm actually going to follow the guidelines. Seriously, follow the guidelines for listening, because when you do follow the guidelines, it helps to eliminate problems down the road. I really seriously believe that.
Yeah, right. For the effort it takes, it's well worth it, and I do believe in it. I think there's just a fine line where people go and take it to an extreme. They just have to be careful, because you don't also want to come across that you keep asking and people say, "Why are they not getting it? I've explained it. It's the same task again and again. Why are they keep asking me questions?" So really just make sure you know why you're doing it, what your purpose is, to make sure you're communicating, and make sure that you're really trying to get to the point of delivering whatever the task is.
Right. So I think there you have it, some tips for listening skills. So this is Lisa B. Marshall and Marc A. Wolfe, and we are MarshallWolfe.com.